Hi, my name is Nick Raboy. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to create an application that visually shows our highlights for an Atlas search. So we're going to be using JavaScript to create a front end and a back end, both using JavaScript. And when we actually do a search, it's going to highlight whatever we've searched for, whether or not be it an exact match or a fuzzy match. So up on my screen, you'll notice that I have a very basic search box. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type in hello. You'll notice that it found two results here. So it highlighted two different occurrences. It highlighted the exact match minus my case capitalization, and it found a match that wasn't quite spelled correctly, but it still could be very valid. You'll see as we progress through this particular tutorial why this is and how you can actually use it to build your own search application where you can actually visually highlight whatever was matched. So this could be useful when it comes to creating, say, your own search engine. Maybe you're building an e-commerce store and the user types something in and you want to highlight maybe parts of the description that the user types in for the user. So that way they can see exactly what was found in their search criteria. There's plenty of different reasons, but this could be a very useful example, and it uses MongoDB Atlas and JavaScript. To make this possible, we're going to need to create a backend and a front-end application. The backend will be responsible for communicating directly with MongoDB, and the front end will be responsible for communicating to our backend and displaying those results on the screen and highlighting that search data. Now, before we even jump into the backend or the front end, let's start to create our data, understand our data model for this example, and then create an index so that way search is possible. So you'll notice that up on my screen, I do have the MongoDB Atlas dashboard open. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Collections. Now, you could either use one of your existing databases and collections, or you can follow along with this tutorial to get the best results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my game dev database, and I'm going to say add a new collection. This collection is going to be called chats. Like I said, you don't need to be using the same collections and databases that I am, but you will get the best results when it comes to this particular tutorial. Now, inside of the chats collection, what we want to do is we want to create a new search index. So go ahead and click on Search Indexes, and we're going to say Create Search Index. Because this is a very basic example, we can go ahead and create a default index that uses dynamic mappings as true. In your example, you may want to specify the analyzer to be used for search. You might want to specify which fields are indexed on the documents, etc. It is totally up to you. But for the simplicity of this particular example, we're going to leave it as the default, and we're going to say create index. Now, index creation is not going to be instant. It may take a few minutes. While the index is being created, let's go ahead and go back into our chats collection, and let's go ahead and add a new document to work with. So I'm going to say insert document. We are using the whole game dev or chat messages for a game system in this example. So let's go ahead and change the object ID to a string. And we're going to hard code it to something human readable. So this ID might represent a chat room for a particular game. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say MongoDB. So this might be a MongoDB chat room. How you design your documents is totally up to you, and it doesn't have to follow my strategy. Now, the next field, let's go ahead and say that this is a messages array. So this is going to be an array of object. And let's go ahead and change this to be an object. And for our first field of this object, let's go ahead and say that this is the sender, so the person actually typing the chat message. Now for this example, the sender information, the timestamp information, anything you add to this document isn't going to be particularly useful. All that we really care about is the message, but it's good to create a semi-realistic example. So let's go ahead and say sender. Let's go ahead and say nraboy. The next field is going to be message, which is going to be the field that matters. And let's just go ahead and say hello world. Now, this particular chat room only has one message for now, but we're going to change this as we progress through the example. So let's go ahead and insert. So the document is inserted and it looks exactly how we created it. Let's go back into search indexes to see the status of that particular index. And it looks like the status is active. So at this point we are good to go. So let's go ahead and start creating our application. So what we're going to do is we're going to start developing a new project. So go ahead and open up your editor of choice. You'll notice that I'm using Visual Studio Code. You'll also notice that it is just an empty project that I've loaded up. We're going to start by creating our backend. So I'm going to say make directory and I'm going to say backend. Now, if you don't have the make directory command on your computer or you're not comfortable with that particular command, go ahead and create that directory however you feel the most comfortable. Now, let's go ahead and navigate into the backend. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to initialize a new Node.js project. So I'm going to say npm init-y. What that'll do is that'll create a package.json file for us, which we can then install each of our dependencies to it. So I can say npm install express MongoDB and course, and I'm going to say -- save. So we're using Express framework for our API, and we're using cores because we plan to create a front end that operates on a different port, and we want to be able to communicate with that API with no kind of cross-origin resource sharing issues. Now, to help us out, in addition to those dependencies, what we want to do is we also want to add a developer dependency, which will help when it comes to serving our application. So I'm going to say npm install nodemon, and I'm going to say -- save dev. Now, with nodemon installed, what I want to do is I want to add it to our script section of the package.json file, and I'm going to say start, and I'm going to say nodemon, and I'm going to say main.js even though it hasn't been created yet. So what we're saying is when we say npm start, it's going to use nodemon and it's going to run our file. So let's go ahead and create that file. Let's go ahead and say touch main.js, and it'll create a main.js file inside of our project. Again, if you don't feel comfortable with the touch command, go ahead and create that main.js file however you feel the most comfortable. Now with that, what I can do is I can say npm start. You'll notice that it's not particularly doing anything because our file is empty, but every time we make a change, it's going to reload our process. Let's go ahead and go into our main.js file. This is where we're going to want to start adding each of the dependencies that we had just downloaded. So let's go ahead and say constant. I'm going to say Mongo client, and I'm going to say equals require, and this is going to be MongoDB. I'm going to say constant express, and I'm going to say require express. And I'm going to say constant course equals require course. Now with that said and done, let's go ahead and start initializing each of these dependencies that we've just now imported, starting with MongoDB. So I'm going to say constant, I'm going to say client equals new Mongo client, and this is where we would define the actual MongoDB cluster URI, whether that be Atlas or something else. Now, ideally what you would want to do is you would want to store this information in an environment variable or configuration file. But for this particular example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste it so that way we can see actually how to create and obtain this information. So let's go back into our MongoDB Atlas dashboard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on database access. I'm going to say add new database user, and I'm going to specify a new user which I'm going to call YouTube. I'm also going to give it a password. I'm going to say password 1234, and we can show it because this is what we plan to use. Now you might be thinking, well, I've just left a password in my database now. Well, I'm actually going to create a temporary user. So this temporary user is going to expire after 6 hours, which is going to be long before this video actually publishes to YouTube. I'm also going to specify what this user should be able to access. Rather than read and write to any database, which is probably too excessive, I'm going to scroll down, I'm going to say grant specific privileges. I'm going to say that this user should be doing a read or write to database game dev and the collection chats because that's what we had created. And I'm going to say add user. Now, if I click on clusters, this is where we're actually going to obtain our URI string. I'm going to say connect, and I'm going to click on connect your application and make sure Node.js is selected. I'm going to say copy, And I'm going to go back into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to paste this string. Now what I want to do is I want to replace the username with YouTube, and I want to replace the password with the one that we had just created, which is password1234. And the database name for the default database, in this case, is going to be GameDev. Now, again, you probably don't want to hard code this string in your application, because then you risk submitting your username and password to, say, GitHub or similar. It's exposed, etc. Definitely use an environment variable or some kind of configuration file for security reasons. Now what we want to do is we want to say constant server equals express. So we're going to initialize express. And because we want to use cores, we can say server.use cores. Now let's start listening on that server. We're going to say server.listen. We're going to listen on a typical Node.js port. And because when we work with MongoDB, it's asynchronous, we want to be either using straight promises or we want to use async and await. My preference is to use async and await, so we're going to do that. We're going to say async, and we're going to say, let's do what happens inside of this function. Now with an async and await, it's best practice to do a try catch. So I'm going to say catch, and if there's an error, what we're going to do is we're going to say console.log e for error. And we're actually going to make this an error instead. And inside of the try, we can say await client.connect. And we also want to define the database and collection that we want to use. But because we want to do it in an actual endpoint and not inside of this callback, let's go ahead and create a global variable. So I'm going to say var collection. And we're just going to define that. And I'm going to say collection equals client.db. We're going to say GameDev, and we're going to say collection is going to be chats. And you could easily add this to an environment variable as well. It's totally up to you. I'm going to save it. And you'll notice that I still do have my NodeMon running, so it restarted when I hit that save button. So let's go ahead and start creating our API endpoint. So this is where things get interesting. So let's go ahead and say that we want to create an endpoint. We're going to say server.get. So this is a get endpoint. And it's going to be search. Because we are working with MongoDB, it is going to be asynchronous. So I'm going to use async. We're going to say request, response, next. And we're going to specify what happens, starting with a try catch block. So for the error, we're going to catch it. And if there was an error, rather than just printing out console log with the error, let's go ahead and return it back to the user. So we're going to say response.status. I'm going to give it kind of a vague response code of 500, which is generally some kind of problem occurred. And we're going to say send. And I'm going to send only the message. So I'm going to say e.message. Let's go ahead and work with our actual logic for MongoDB. So this is where we actually use a MongoDB aggregation pipeline. So that's how you use Atlas Search. So with an aggregation pipeline for search, the search operator has to be the first stage of the pipeline. What happens after that is totally up to you. You could have as many stages as you want to make your application a success. So let's go ahead and start with that search stage. So let's first say let result equals await. We're going to say collection.aggregate. This is an array because we're going to have an array of stages. Before we even add that search stage and whatever comes next, let's go ahead and say that we want the results to be an array. And then we're going to send the result back to the user. We're going to say response. It's going to be 200 by default, but we're going to say send, and we're going to say result. So let's work with each of our stages, starting with search. Let's go ahead and use that search operator. And let's go ahead and say that we want to do a text search. And for our text search, let's go ahead and specify the query that we want to use. So this query, we're actually going to use the query parameters that the user adds to this particular endpoint. So let's go ahead and use a backtick character with a $ curly bracket. And we're going to say request.query, as in query parameters for the request. And we're going to look for the term parameter. So that's going to be our search criteria. Next up, we want to specify a path. Which particular field or fields do we want to search against? Even though that we have a dynamic index, we probably still want to specify which fields we want to search. So in this example, we're going to say messages.message. So we're going to search within the messages array and the message field in those objects. Finally, what you can do, and this is totally up to you, but we can specify some kind of fuzzy factor. So with fuzzy, we don't have to have exact matches on our terms. So if we have a fuzzy factor of 0, so a max edit of 0, it means our terms have to match. But as we start increasing the number for our max edits, well, then we start getting some kind of vagueness in our search. So for example, if I have a max edit of 1 and I search for hello, but I fail to include one of the L's, it'll still come back in the search results. Likewise, if maybe one of those L's becomes a K, it'll still come back. And you can read more about fuzzy in the MongoDB Atlas Search documentation, but it is quite powerful. Just note that as you start increasing the max edits, your results might not be as strict, and it may be a little more resource intensive. So let's go ahead and say max edits. We're going to say 2 in this example, and we could always mess around with it later. What we want to do, because while this will work, this text search, we do want the highlight information. The highlight information is not going to come back by default. So what we want to do is we want to actually specify that it does. So we're going to say highlight, and we want to specify the path to highlight. So we're going to say path, and likewise, we're going to say messages.message. Now, this will tell us what path to highlight, but still, it's not going to come back in our results because the highlight information is not part of our original document, even though that now technically it could be available to us. So what we want to do is we want to either use a project or an add fields operator. So this will add fields to our document result. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and add another search parameter. So let's go ahead and add another pipeline stage. So this is outside of the search, and what we're going to do is we're going to say add fields. Now for add fields, what we're going to do is we're going to say highlights, which is going to be the field that we want to add to our results. So that's the field for our results. And we're going to say that we want to use the meta operator. And we want to say that we want to include search highlights from the meta. So search highlights being a reserved word. So we're going to add this highlights field with highlight information. So was it a hit? Was it an adjacent piece of text, etc. So that is our 2-stage pipeline. If you wanted to, you could add many other stages to this pipeline as well, but search has to be that first stage. So what we can do is we can test it out. Let's go ahead and go to our web browser. So we're currently serving our application. Let's go ahead and open up a new tab. I'm going to say localhost 3000, and I'm going to say that the endpoint is going to be search. We're going to say term, and we're going to say hello. Now you'll notice that we got information back. We have found a hit. And we found a hit on hello, which was an exact match. Now let's go ahead and search for a misspelling. So we're omitting one of the L's. It's still a hit because we have a fuzzy max edit of more than 0. And then we have the adjacent text that comes with it. So this information is going to be very useful when it comes to actually highlighting our data on the screen in a front end application. So let's do part 2 of this particular example, which is the front end. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split this terminal, and I am going to create a new directory at the root of our project. So let's go ahead and say that this is going to be make directory front end, and I'm going to navigate into it. So cd front end. Now this is going to be more or less basic in comparison to our Node.js application. So what I want to do is I want to start by saying touch index.html. And I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide the Explorer because we no longer need what we see inside of our Explorer. So let's work inside of our index.html file, which is part of our front end. Let's go ahead and add some boilerplate HTML. So we have our boilerplate HTML. Let's go ahead and add a search field. So I'm going to say div, and inside that div, I'm going to have input ID equals term, which is going to be useful when it comes to actually searching. And I'm going to say type equals text. We're going to have a button, and this button is going to be type equals button. And it's going to have an onClick, which we'll define in just a moment. And for the text, it's going to be search. So there's not going to be nothing fancy about the UI for this example. It doesn't serve a purpose to have a fancy UI for this example. After the div, let's go ahead and add a line break. And let's have an area for our output. So we're going to say div, and we're going to say ID equals output. And this is where our output is going to be rendered with JavaScript. So it's going to be empty by default. We're going to do our search. The search is going to come back with results. JavaScript is going to populate this div, and we're going to be good. So because we're going to be using JavaScript, let's go ahead and add some script tags. So what we can say is we can say constant, we can say search equals, this is going to be asynchronous because it's server side that we're working with. And we're going to say let term equals document.get element by ID. Should be that one. And this is going to be term. Likewise, we're going to do the same thing for the output. This is just to get us started. All right, so we have search, we're getting each of the output and the term. Let's go ahead and wire up that onClick. So this is going to be now search. So when we actually click the button, it's going to call this function. And this is where we're going to actually start adding our useful code. So actually for highlighting. So it's going to be a little weird at first. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be adding data to this output. The data is actually going to be the results of our search, but because we have the hit and the text information that comes back, hence this example right here, we need to actually choose to highlight the hit, but we can't just trust that the text, the adjacent text, is going to be every last bit of our remaining text for that particular search, because it probably won't be. So instead of just saying, you know what, we're going to add our adjacent text, we're going to add the hit, we're going to wrap it in some kind of mark tag, we actually need to do a JavaScript find and replace, but we don't want to trust a regular expression with JavaScript that might be counterintuitive to our search example. So we're going to do a few manipulations. It may seem a little bit complex at first, but I'll walk you through it. I'll make sure that it's not as difficult as it could be. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. The first thing that we want to do is we want to say output.inner HTML equals empty string. So first thing that we do is we clear out whatever was inside of that output because we don't want to just append to the list. The next thing we want to do is we want to do a JavaScript fetch. We want to actually get the results so that way we can do something with it. So we can say let result equals await fetch. We're going to say HTTP localhost 3000 search term equals, and this is going to be the term dot value. Now, if you forgot to include cores in your Express Framework application, there's a good chance you're going to run into problems here because it's a different port. So definitely double check that. What we're going to do is we're going to say then, and we're going to say result. Actually, let's go ahead and call it response. And we're going to say response.json. So we want to convert our response into JSON. And because this is a wait, we can just progress down the line. Now, let's go ahead and wrap this in a try catch. It's good practice because we're using async and await. And let's indent this so that way it looks nice. Let's go ahead and save it. Let's go ahead and serve our front end. So I'm using an actual package called serve. So you can say npm install serve global. So I've actually already got it. So I'm going to say serve. Oh, it should be serve, not server. It's going to be on localhost 5000. Let's go ahead and open up a new tab, localhost 5000. We have our search box. It doesn't really do anything. So let's go ahead and inspect it. Make sure that up to now everything looks good. I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to click search. And it doesn't do anything. It does an error, which is good, but it doesn't do anything either. So let's go ahead and continue down the line here. Let's go ahead and say that, first of all, we want to loop through each of the chats that came back in the result. Now, we only have one chat. The chat room is called MongoDB, but there could be more than one. So I'm going to say result.forEach, and I'm going to call it chat. Now, inside of this for each loop, let's go ahead and create a new div to store our messages. So we're going to say let message container equals document.createElement, and we're going to say that this is div, so we're creating a new div. We want to specify the inner HTML for this container. So basically what we want to do is we want to just specify that which room we're in. So we're going to say message container dot inner HTML equals, and I'll use a backtick character. Let's go ahead and bold it, and we're going to say chat, and we're going to use $ curly bracket chat dot underscore ID, because remember our underscore ID is just a string, which we're at this point calling MongoDB. We're going to say strong. And the next thing we want to do is, because we're working with an array of chat messages, is we need to loop through those as well. So we're going to say chat.messages. We're going to say .forEach. We're going to say message. And we're going to now do some manipulations here. So we're looking at each message that comes back in the messages array for that particular chat room. So starting with a new element, because we have our parent div, which is all of the chat messages for that group. Let's go ahead and say that maybe let message equals document.createElement. This is maybe a paragraph for each one of our chat messages. Let's go ahead and do another loop, because remember, we have an array of highlights. It's not just one highlight. It's an array of highlights. There could be numerous hits and numerous adjacent text. So let's go ahead and say chat.highlights.forEach. Let's go ahead and say highlight, so our single highlight. And let's go ahead and start doing our replacements, because we can't just rely on the adjacent text to populate our entire chat message. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something like this. We're going to say let texts equal highlight dot texts, because that's what it's called inside of our data here. So we have highlights and then texts. So let's go ahead and go back into our editor. And let's go ahead and create a replacements. So we're going to say let replacements. And we're going to say equals text.map. So we're going to do a manipulation to each text in the texts. So let's go ahead and say text. Let's go ahead and say for each text, we're going to say if the text.type equals a hit, because each text has a type, whether that be a text or a hit. And it's like a tongue twister. But if it's a hit, we're going to say return, and we're going to say that we want to wrap it in a mark tag. So that'll highlight it for us. Let's go ahead and use backtick character. We're going to say mark. Let's go ahead and say that we're going to use text.value, and we're going to say mark. Otherwise, if it wasn't a hit, that means it's just plain text or adjacent text. We're going to say return text.value, so just return whatever it was. Now this map, it returns an array. So basically what's going to happen is we're going to have our original adjacent text to the hit, which may or may not be our entire string. And we have now our new highlight data. So because we have an array, what we probably want to do is we probably want to do a join to turn it into a single string rather than an array of elements. So let's join, and the actual adjacent text, it does include space characters. So you'll notice here it's hard to see, but there's a space character there. So when we join it into a string, we don't have to have any kind of delimiter there. It's already taken care of for us. So we have the potential replacements to replace. Let's go ahead and look at the originals. So we're going to say let originals equals text.map. text, and we're going to say return text.value. So we don't really care about all of the types. We don't care about all of the stuff that comes with it. We only want the actual text. So we're returning the value. And we also don't want an array, so we're also going to join. Now that we're done with that, let's go ahead and do a replacement. So this is where we're going to rely on actual plain JavaScript. So let's go ahead and say message equals message.replace. So that's a string replace. So we're going to use originals and we're going to use replacements. So we're going to replace the original with the replacements. And again, we can't just replace the hit value, because JavaScript uses a regular expression. There's a chance, depending on, let's say that we have hello world, all one word, no space, it's probably not going to make a hit inside of Atlas Search. But if we do a replace for hello, we don't want any kind of false positives. We don't want that hello world one word to be touched. So it's best that we do a full replace using not only the hit text, but the adjacent text with it. It'll give us a much more accurate result. So we have that. So let's go ahead and get out of our highlights for each loop. Let's go ahead and say message.innerHTML equals message.sender plus message.message. So it's going to have the sender ID plus the message itself. And we're going to say message container.append child, and we're going to say message. So the message that we've been working with. So the paragraph is going to be added to the message container div, so that way it'll display it on the screen. Now finally, what we want to do is we want to say output.append child, and we want to say message container, so that way message container is finally rendered to the screen. Now hopefully everything works now. So we're still serving our front end, we're still serving our back end. Let's go back into our browser. Let's go back and refresh our page. Let's go ahead and say hello. We're going to say search, and you'll notice that hello is now highlighted. So maybe we can add some more data to our database to make sure everything works out good. So let's go ahead and go back into our collections, and let's go, as soon as it loads, into our game dev database and chats collection. So we're just going to modify this one chat room. We're not going to create another chat room. So let's say edit. Let's go ahead and add another object here. All right. So this one is going to be, likewise, it's going to be another object. Our first field is going to be sender. I'm going to change the sender. I'm going to say a techa. And the message is going to be, this is another hello, it's misspelled on purpose, world application. So I'm going to say update. And we're going to go back into our application. I'm going to refresh it. I'm going to say hello. I'm going to spell it correctly. And you'll notice that they're both highlighted because we have fuzzy. And the highlights are working. We're actually highlighting that data using some very basic JavaScript. We're using the mark tags, but we're visually showing our highlights on the screen rather than working with an array of highlight data. Now, you could have more than one highlight for a given string. So you could have more than one hit. You could have more than one adjacent text, depending on how many hits you have. So it may not always look as simple as this. It's whatever the database decides to return. You're also going to have a score. So the higher the score, the better the match. Because if you're using a fuzzy search, whatever the user types in might not be exactly what was found. So it's totally up to you. So you just saw how to create a highlighting application for Atlas Search using Node.js and simple JavaScript.